In this segment, I'm going to give some tips and explanations on hard modding a PlayStation 2. Before we begin, default disclaimer. You know, piracy and bootlegging is a crime, blah blah blah. You can go to jail, you can go to hell, you can get raped by Satan, big bucktooth, bad breath Bubbit in jail. Whatever. Not going to teach you morals here. Don't pirate games. Now, on a serious note, the legality of this. In some countries, in some states, in some places in the universe, buying a mod chip for a PS2 is a crime. So check your local laws and make sure that you're not actually committing a crime just by purchasing one. Now, before you actually buy a PS2, you need to know what version PlayStation 2 you have. You can actually flip your console around, and right here on the back label you're going to have a serial number. That serial number will actually denote what version PlayStation 2 you have, or at least give you a damn good clue. Another way to determine is, in here inside the actual IDE bay, in the hard drive bay, you might have some screws, you might not. You will also know that notice that some PlayStation 2s actually have more of these little feet for screws than some others do not. So I'll put some links in the show notes on how to actually determine what version PlayStation 2 you have. Now, you need to get the right chip for the right job. Now, back in the early day, one of the things about chips that I really hate is you actually have to go and finger fuck the eject and power button repeatedly to determine which mode you boot into. Now, there are different ways and different modes you can boot into the PS2. You can boot from the memory card, you can boot from the optical drive, and you can boot from the hard drive. If you're going to boot from the optical drive, you got PlayStation 2 mode, you got PlayStation 1 mode, DVD-ROM mode, which would be like DVD movies, and you got CD audio. If you wanted to go ahead and, play a DVD movie, you'd put the disc in, you'd hold the power button for 2 seconds, you'd hit eject for 2 seconds, you put the disc in, you hold eject for 2 seconds, and then you're in DVD mode. Or if you wanted to play a PlayStation 1 game, you'd have to hold the power button, you'd have to hit power on by holding power for 5 seconds and hit eject for 2 seconds, put the disc in, and then put it in, and then if you want to play a PlayStation 2 game, you have to go and hit the eject button for 6 seconds, and then hit the eject button for 4 seconds, you have to face 42 degrees north-northwest and masturbate in your 40th trimester with a silver spoon sticking out of your ass. It was a major league pain. When you get a chip, make sure you get something that has automatic boot detection. It'll automatically determine whether you have code on the memory card, the hard drive, or the optical drive, and boot from it accordingly. Very, very useful. The second thing you want to look for is make sure your chip actually has onboard storage for configuration. A lot of chips nowadays, even the low-end ones, have it so you can actually tweak out and say, okay, I only want to boot my homebrew from the memory card, I only want to boot it from the optical, I only want to boot from the hard drive, and it'll give you a whole bunch of really nice options. One of the options, if you're going to boot from hard drive, to look for is ATA patching. Sony was kind of douchebags when it came to letting you use whatever hard drives that you wanted in your PlayStation 2, so you could only use the Sony-branded PS2 hard drives. With ATA patching, you can use whatever hard drive you want as long as it fits inside the case. You also want to make sure that your chip will have sleep mode, because sometimes you could be playing an original game that'll detect your chip and erase it. Or, for whatever reason, you're running some homebrew and you're testing some code and you did something so horribly wrong that it completely wiped out your chip. You want to make it so that the chip will either go to sleep or protect itself that it cannot be rewritten to. It'll only rewrite the configuration. So it's kind of like formatting your computer, the enema of the electronic world. It's a pain in the ass, no one wants to go through it, but once it's done, everything is just so much better, even though you want it to or not. So, there's actually a lot of features to look for in a chip. Some of the more professional chips, I'd like to call, or the ones tailored for homebrew, will actually allow you to put your executable files on the chip itself. So you don't need a memory card, you don't need a DVD-ROM or your CD, and you don't need a hard drive. You can boot directly from the chip, and then from there, continue on with your development. Those are actually pretty cool. I would highly recommend the DMS version 4, or the DMS4 mod chip, or the DMS3 if you really want to get into homebrew. But if you really just want to go and follow the homebrew scene and just, pick up burn a homebrew disk and put it in and get it to run, anything that'll boot from typical media without having any really major league pushing buttons, fiddling wires, and all that crap. Just get a chip that'll boot your media and possibly do ATA drive support. Those are actually the two important features. Okay, so you figured out what version PlayStation 2 you have, you picked out a chip that you want. I'm going to go to the table side and I'll install a chip, and I'll give you some really great pointers to installing a chip. And hell, even if you're not installing a chip and you like to solder stuff, this is actually good to watch. Here we have a version 7 PlayStation 2. Here's the mod kit. The first thing you want to do once you take your PlayStation apart, while taking your PlayStation apart, be really careful for any ribbon cables that might plug into any of the sides. Those ribbon cables are very easy to damage, and the number one problem with any PlayStation 2 is that the ribbon cable that plugs into the front panel eject and power will tear or break. That usually plugs into here or over here, depending on which version you have. Now, I've disassembled everything and I've tried to position my camera. I'm going to have to zoom in a little bit. Here's the chip. Usually the chip will make a home around here somewhere. There's usually a little hole in the board. Really, depending on the chip and the make and the model of your PlayStation, the make and the model of your chip, and your soldering capabilities will determine where it goes. So in my case, I'm going to put this here. Now there are a whole lot of really small surface mount stuff that you're going to have to solder onto. Would highly recommend some kind of locking forceps. These are called hemostats with a nice angled tip on them. 30 gauge or thinner wire. Solder, of course. Desoldering braid. But if you're going to use this, chances are that you've just destroyed your PlayStation 2. I'm very fond of the term, if you want a job done right, do it yourself. If you do not feel comfortable with your soldering capabilities, I would strongly recommend you do not try this. This is one of the hardest things I've ever had to mod. I've got a lot of soldering experience. I'm not overplaying my skills here. This is very, very, very difficult. I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to start getting to work. I don't know how much of the footage will be usable, but I'll salvage whatever I can. When dealing with the voltage supply leads, don't use 30 gauge Kynar wire, use something like 20, 22, or 26 gauge. Reason being is these tiny thin little wires aren't going to be able to carry the appropriate current and voltage to the chip. So go ahead and use some slightly thicker wire. Also, if you've noticed, I've been pre-tinning all of my wires. I've been getting a nice shiny coat of solder on it, and then I've, right afterwards, cleaned my tip off on a wet sponge or a wet paper towel or something. The reason being is you do not want an excessive amount of solder on such very small surface mount components. Remember, solder will flow to other points of bare copper and solder. So if you have an excessive amount of solder on your tip, like here's my tip, if you notice, it's just nice and shiny silver, very sharp as well. If you have an excessive amount of solder on the tip, it's going to flow and cross pads and leads. This stuff is too small to use desoldering braid. You can't tell, but over here we got to solder some wires that lead into the BIOS. I have pre-tinned these pads. Be very, very careful. Do not use an excessive amount of heat. A 35-watt soldering iron for too long on these pads will cause heat damage. They will peel up and you will be absurdly fucked. Remember, when dealing with wire, solid wire retains its shape. So there's no reason you have to go and get your hands in really awkward, let me see if I can get on frame a little bit better. No reason you have to go and get into really insanely awkward positions. So you can go ahead and bend your wire or your lead so you can get into a position that's a little easier for your hands, especially for someone who's like me who's got very big clumsy hands. Get into place and solder. And remember, solder sticks to solder, so pre-tin your wire, pre-tin your pad. If it's not a solder point, like in a few seconds I got to solder to the actual legs of this BIOS chip, and because those already have solder on it, it already sticks. But if you notice that like I said, I pre-tin this pad and now it's sticking pretty well. Whenever you have wires, you see these big chips. Whenever you're routing the wires, do not route them over the chips. Route them around and through components. Try to group the wires together. I'll show you in a little bit. But you remember the electronic stethoscope segment where I explained that when you pass electrons and voltage through the microprocessors and different chips, it creates an electromagnetic field? Well, these wires will actually pick up all of that interference, and it will have a negative impact on the function of your mod chip. And you only want to have to solder these wires once. So, when you're routing all your wires to your mod chip, make sure that they're not passing over anything. Every once in a while, it's okay to take a hot glue gun to hot glue your wires down, or even just some electrical tape, just to make sure your wires are in place and they don't move around too much. I know some people that actually go even further than that. Once all of this is done, they'll actually take some clear epoxy putty, or some clear epoxy, and they'll actually put it over all of their solder points, just so nothing can go wrong and these wires can't pull off. If these wires pull off, they're going to pull the traces with them, they're going to pull the pads with them, and possibly even components, destroying your PlayStation 2. There you go. Like I said, these pads are already pre-tinned. They got a small amount of solder on there, so the wire sticks really, really quick, really easy. Whenever you're soldering pins that are very close together, it's good to have what I call a low angle of attack. Instead of coming straight down on top of your components with your iron, come in as low and as flat as possible. That way, it doesn't obstruct your view, and you can get as flat down to the board as possible. Just like so. I've been stripping the wires a little bit long, pretty much just using my teeth, and then I'll tin it, and then using a regular pair of angle cutters, diagonal cutters, or even a pair of toenail clippers. Clip off as much of the excess tinned soldered wire as possible. I've also been cutting these wires excessively long. That way I know that they'll route to the mod chip, because you can't cut a wire to become longer. I don't know how well you can see this, but I've actually sharply angled the tinned wire at close to 90-degree angles. Reason being is this is going to wrap around the top of the chip. Now I know I said to not do this. This is a risk you'll have to take, and in my experience of modding PlayStation 2s, mounting the wires like this